Hey guys, tonight we descend into the lavish, absurd, and occasionally unsanitary world of medieval knights, where honor, violence, and absolutely no concept of personal hygiene collided in spectacular fashion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me tell you, what we're diving into today makes modern workplace complaints look like minor inconveniences at a 5-star resort. Picture this. You're living in an age where your career was probably decided by someone who'd never asked what you wanted to be when you grew up. Healthcare was basically praying really hard while someone poured herbs on your wounds. And the concept of workers' rights meant your Lord might not execute you for minor infractions, maybe. In this world, being a knight wasn't just a prestigious job. It was a lifetime sentence of violence, financial ruin, and social obligations that would make modern middle management look like a dream vacation. Let's be clear about something from the start. Everything you think you know about medieval knights is probably wrong. Hollywood has sold us this romantic notion of noble warriors in shining armor, galloping across sun-drenched fields to rescue damsels and defend the innocent. That's right. We've been fed a steady diet of Arthurian fantasy that bears about as much resemblance to actual medieval knighthood as a McDonald's commercial does to the experience of eating a Big Mac at 2 a.m. in a fluorescent-lit restaurant that smells faintly of existential dread. The reality? Knights were essentially medieval middle management with weapons, caught between demanding bosses above them and resentful peasants below, armed with expensive equipment they couldn't afford, bound by codes of conduct that made no practical sense, and constantly one bad harvest or military campaign away from financial ruin. Sound familiar? To be fair, knights did occupy a privileged position in medieval society. They were the warrior elite, the professional soldiers who formed the backbone of medieval armies and the feudal system. But privilege in the medieval world was a double-edged sword, literally in many cases. With great power came great responsibility, great expense, great danger, and great likelihood of dying violently in a muddy field somewhere, probably over a property dispute that nobody would remember 50 years later. If you thought modern life was stressful, with its mortgage payments, performance reviews, and social media pressure, think again. Medieval knights dealt with all the political maneuvering and financial pressure of modern professionals, plus the added joy of potentially being hacked to pieces by someone who disagreed with their boss's foreign policy. And unlike modern careers, there was no such thing as switching jobs, taking a mental health day, or filing a complaint with HR when your lord decided to use you as cannon fodder in his latest territorial expansion project. The knight's life was a perfect storm of impossibly high expectations, crushing debt, constant physical danger, and social obligations that would make a modern diplomat's schedule look relaxing. They were expected to be warriors, diplomats, landlords, judges, and moral exemplars, all while wearing 70 pounds of metal in an age before deodorant was invented. Meanwhile, they had to maintain this facade of noble perfection while dealing with the same basic human needs as everyone else: food, shelter, security, and the occasional moment of happiness that wasn't interrupted by someone trying to kill them. Of course, the medieval period wasn't a monolith. Knighthood evolved over several centuries, from the rough-and-tumble mounted warriors of the early medieval period to the highly codified, ceremony-obsessed knights of the late medieval era. By the time we get to the 15th century, knighthood had become so ritualized and expensive that it was pricing itself out of military relevance. Kind of like how modern luxury cars have so many features that they've forgotten their primary purpose is to get you from point A to point B without bankrupting you. And yet, despite all the hardships we're about to explore, thousands of young men aspired to knighthood throughout the medieval period. Why? Because the alternatives were often worse. In a world where most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, where literacy was rare and social mobility was practically non-existent, knighthood offered at least the possibility of adventure, wealth, and status. It was like buying a lottery ticket, except instead of losing a few dollars, you risked losing your life, your limb, and your sanity. Still, before we dive into the specific ways that knighthood was a medieval nightmare wrapped in chainmail and topped with a helmet that limited your vision to roughly that of looking through a mail slot, it's worth acknowledging that these men, and they were almost exclusively men, shaped the course of European history. Their actions, decisions, and frankly poor judgment calls influenced everything from the development of military technology to the evolution of romantic literature. They were simultaneously the architects and victims of a system that valued violence, hierarchy, and rigid social control above human happiness or basic common sense thought. So buckle up, because we're about to explore why choosing to be a knight in medieval times was roughly equivalent to volunteering for a lifetime subscription to a magazine called Expensive Ways to Risk Death While Maintaining Social Obligations. From the nightmare of training to the horror of actual combat, from the crushing debt to the impossible social expectations, we'll examine every aspect of why, despite the glamorous reputation, being a knight was one of the worst career choices in human history. Let's be honest about medieval knight training. It was less prestigious military academy and more 12-year hazing ritual designed to break your spirit and your bones in roughly equal measure. If you thought modern military boot camp was tough, medieval knight training made it look like a relaxing summer camp with better food and considerably less chance of accidental death. The journey to knighthood began around age 7. That's right, 7. When boys from noble families were shipped off to serve as pages in other noble households. Picture sending your second grader to live with strangers who were legally allowed to beat him for educational purposes. And you'll start to get the idea. These weren't boarding schools with caring teachers and structured curriculums. These were working households where children were expected to earn their keep while learning the basics of noble behavior. As a page, your daily routine would make a modern intern weep with gratitude for their unpaid position. You'd wake before dawn, because medieval society believed that sleeping past sunrise was a moral failing, to help your lord dress, which was no simple task when clothing involved multiple layers, complex fastenings, and the constant possibility that you'd accidentally stab yourself on a decorative brooch. Then you'd serve at meals, which meant standing for hours, holding platters while nobles ate with their hands and threw bones on the floor for the dogs. Sound familiar? It's like being a waiter, except your customers were armed and legally entitled to hit you if they didn't like your service. Meanwhile, when you weren't busy with domestic duties, you were supposed to be learning the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, assuming your host household considered education important enough to bother with. Many pages learned to read just enough to understand military orders and religious texts, which was considered perfectly adequate for their future careers. After all, why waste time on comprehensive education when you were destined to spend most of your adult life hitting people with swords? To be fair, pages also received training in music, dancing, and courtly manners, skills that would prove essential for navigating the complex social dynamics of medieval court life. But imagine trying to master the intricacies of courtly dance while your body was still recovering from yesterday's beating for incorrectly arranging the salt cellars. It was like trying to learn ballet while suffering from chronic stress disorder. By the time you reached 14, if you survived that, long without dying from disease, accident, or the occasionally overzealous correction from your betters, you graduated to the rank of squire. This was considered a promotion, roughly equivalent to being promoted from unpaid intern to unpaid intern with additional responsibilities and higher expectations. As a squire, Your primary job was to serve a specific knight, which meant becoming intimately familiar with every aspect of medieval military equipment. You learned to maintain armor, a process that made modern car maintenance look simple and straightforward. Chainmail had to be cleaned regularly to prevent rust, which meant scrubbing thousands of tiny metal rings with sand and oil. Plate armor required constant attention to prevent corrosion, plus regular adjustments as your knight inevitably gained weight from the medieval diet of meat, bread, and ale. And God help you if a piece of equipment was damaged or lost during a campaign. Replacing it would cost more than most peasants made in several years. Of course, maintaining equipment was just the beginning. Squires were also responsible for helping their knights dress for battle, which was a complex choreographed process that could take an hour or more. First came the padded undergarments, then the chainmail, then the plate armor, each piece carefully fitted and secured. One mistake in the process could leave your knight vulnerable to attack, which tended to make knights rather particular about the quality of their squire's work. Still, the equipment maintenance and dressing duties were probably the easy part of being a squire. You were also expected to accompany your knight into actual combat, armed with basic weapons and minimal training. Imagine being a teenager, asked to run into a medieval battlefield armed with a sword you barely knew how to use, surrounded by grown men whose job was to kill as many people as possible. The survival rate for squires in major battles was not what you'd call encouraging. If you thought the physical training was bad, the social education was equally brutal. Medieval society operated on a complex system of hierarchy, honor, and obligation. That made modern corporate politics look straightforward. As a squire, you had to learn not just who outranked him, but exactly how to show appropriate deference to each level of nobility. The wrong gesture, the improper form of address, or even making eye contact with someone significantly above your station could result in anything from public humiliation to physical punishment. And yet, despite all these challenges, the training wasn't even consistent or standardized. There were no knight training manuals, no standardized curriculum, no quality control measures. Your education depended entirely on the knowledge, temperament, and teaching ability of whoever you happened to be serving. Some knights were excellent mentors who took their teaching responsibilities seriously. Others were barely competent themselves and saw training squires as an annoying distraction from their real interests, like drinking, gambling, and complaining about how much better things were in the old days. By around age 21, if you'd survived the training, demonstrated basic competence with weapons, and hadn't completely disgraced yourself or your family, you might be eligible for the ceremony of knighthood. But even this final step was fraught with complications. The ceremony itself was expensive. You had to provide your own equipment, host a feast for other nobles, and make generous donations to the local church. Many perfectly competent squires remained squires for years, simply because they couldn't afford the cost of becoming knights. Meanwhile, the actual ceremony was designed to emphasize just how serious and sacred knighthood was supposed to be. You'd spend the night before your dubbing in prayer and contemplation, often kneeling in a cold church for hours while contemplating the weight of your upcoming responsibilities. The ceremony itself involved swearing elaborate oaths to protect the weak, defend the church, and uphold justice, oaths that sounded noble and inspiring, right up until you encountered your first real-world situation where upholding justice meant choosing between competing interests of equally powerful nobles. To be fair, not everyone who started training became a knight. Many pages and squires found other careers or simply gave up on the whole enterprise. Others died during training from disease, accidents, or the various hazards of medieval life. Still others were dismissed for incompetence, misconduct, or simply not meeting the social standards expected of knights. But for those who did complete the training and achieve knighthood, The real challenges were just beginning, because after spending 14 years learning to be a knight, you now had to figure out how to make a living as one. And as we'll see in the coming chapters, the gap between knightly training and knightly reality was roughly equivalent to the gap between medical school and actually practicing medicine during a plague outbreak, while blindfolded and using equipment borrowed from a museum. Of course, the training system produced some genuinely skilled warriors and capable leaders. The medieval period saw numerous examples of knights who lived up to the ideals they'd been taught and made positive contributions to their societies. But for every shining example of knightly virtue, there were dozens of others who struggled with the impossible expectations, crushing responsibilities, and constant physical danger that defined their profession. The training system was also remarkably effective at perpetuating the social and economic structures of medieval society. By taking children from noble families and subjecting them to years of hierarchical conditioning, it ensured that the next generation of knights would accept and enforce the same system that had shaped them. It was like a very expensive, very dangerous version of corporate training, designed to produce employees who would never question the fundamental assumptions of their workplace culture. Let's be clear about medieval armor. It was the equivalent of driving a luxury car that cost more than your house, required constant maintenance, provided questionable protection, and had the fuel efficiency of a small aircraft carrier. If you thought car payments were stressful, try making payments on something that could mean the difference between life and death in combat, while also serving as the primary indicator of your social status and professional competence. That's right. Armor wasn't just protection. It was advertisement, investment, and liability, all wrapped up in 70 pounds of metal that you had to wear while trying to fight for your life. The cheapest suit of decent armor cost about as much as a modern luxury car. And like luxury cars, the maintenance costs would bankrupt you if you weren't careful. Meanwhile, wearing it was roughly equivalent to exercising while wrapped in a metal sleeping bag that limited your vision, hearing, and mobility. To be fair, armor technology evolved significantly throughout the medieval period. Early knights made do with chainmail, thousands of tiny metal rings linked together to form a flexible mesh that provided decent protection against slashing attacks. Chainmail was relatively lightweight and allowed good mobility, but it had some significant drawbacks. For starters, it did almost nothing to stop crushing blows from maces or warhammers. Getting hit by a heavy weapon while wearing chainmail was like being inside a metal bag when someone hit you with a baseball bat. The impact was distributed, but you still felt every bit of it. Plus, chainmail required constant maintenance. Each ring had to be individually cleaned and oiled to prevent rust. A single suit of chainmail contained thousands of rings, meaning that proper maintenance was a part-time job in itself. And if the mail was damaged in combat, repairing it required specialized skills and considerable time. Imagine trying to fix a broken zipper, except the zipper weighs 50 pounds and your life depends on it working perfectly. By the 13th and 14th centuries, knights began supplementing chainmail with plate armor, individual pieces of shaped metal designed to cover specific body parts. This was a significant improvement in terms of protection, but it came with its own set of problems. Good plate armor required precise fitting by skilled armorers, which made it even more expensive than chainmail. A full suit of high quality plate armor cost more than a small farm, and that's assuming you could find an armorer skilled enough to make it properly. Of course, the expense didn't end with the initial purchase. Plate armor required constant adjustment as knights gained or lost weight, and medieval diets, heavy on meat and alcohol, tended to cause significant weight fluctuations. Professional armorers charged premium rates for adjustments, and a poorly fitting piece could be worse than useless in combat. Imagine wearing a business suit that cost $50,000 and had to be perfectly tailored. Except if it didn't fit right, you die. Asterisk. Meanwhile, the weight of full-plate armor was genuinely problematic. 70 pounds might not sound like much, but try carrying a 70-pound backpack while climbing stairs, and you'll start to appreciate the cardiovascular challenges faced by medieval knights. The weight was distributed across the body, which helped, but it still meant that knights tired quickly in combat and needed help mounting and dismounting their horses. Sound familiar? It's like modern military equipment, theoretically designed to help soldiers, but often so heavy and cumbersome that it creates as many problems as it solves. Except medieval knights didn't have the benefit of modern materials science or ergonomic design. They were basically wearing prototype technology that had been developed through trial and error by craftsmen who had never actually used the stuff in combat themselves. And yet, despite the expense and inconvenience, armor was absolutely necessary for survival in medieval warfare. Knights without proper armor died quickly and unpleasantly. This created a vicious cycle where knights had to spend enormous amounts of money on equipment they couldn't really afford, just to have a chance of surviving long enough to earn the money to pay for the equipment. The social pressure was equally intense. Your armor was a visible indicator of your wealth, status, and professionalism. Wearing outdated or poorly maintained armor was like showing up to a business meeting in a 20-year-old suit with stains on it. It undermined your credibility and marked you as someone who either couldn't afford better or didn't care enough to invest in proper equipment. In a society where reputation was everything, this kind of social judgment could be professionally devastating. To be fair, armor technology did improve over time. By the 15th century, armorers had developed sophisticated techniques for creating lightweight, well-fitted plate armor that provided excellent protection without completely immobilizing the wearer. The best late medieval armor was a genuine marvel of craftsmanship, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge about metallurgy, engineering, and human anatomy. But even the best armor had significant limitations. Vision was always compromised. Medieval helmets severely limited peripheral vision and made it difficult to see attacks coming from the sides or rear. Hearing was muffled, making communication difficult during the chaos of battle. And despite popular misconceptions, knights in full armor were not invulnerable. Crossbow bolts, warhammers, and specialized anti-armor weapons could penetrate even the best protection. Still, the psychological effect of good armor shouldn't be underestimated. A properly armored knight was genuinely intimidating. Armored knight was genuinely intimidating, both to brust and array enemies and to common soldiers. The armor served as both protection and psychological warfare, making knights appear larger, more powerful, and less human than their opponents. This intimidation factor was often as important as the actual protection provided by the metal. Of course, armor also created some rather embarrassing practical problems that Hollywood tends to ignore. Going to the bathroom while wearing full plate armor required careful planning and sometimes assistance from your squire. Eating and drinking were difficult with a helmet on, but removing the helmet in a combat zone left you vulnerable. And medieval armor provided no protection against heat exhaustion. Knights regularly passed out from overheating during summer campaigns. The maintenance requirements were genuinely staggering. In addition to regular cleaning and oiling, armor needed frequent repairs and adjustments. Dents had to be hammered out, joints had to be maintained, and worn pieces had to be replaced. A knight's relationship with his armorer was often more important than his relationships with his family members, and considerably more expensive. Meanwhile, advances in military technology gradually made armor less effective. The development of crossbows, gunpowder weapons, and specialized armor-piercing techniques meant that armor was locked in an arms race with weapons technology. Each improvement in protection led to improvements in armor-defeating weapons, which led to heavier, more expensive armor, which led to better weapons, and so on. By the end of the medieval period, armor had become so heavy and expensive that it was pricing itself out of practical military use. And yet, knights continued to invest enormous amounts of money in armor, partly because it was necessary for their profession and partly because it had become so central to their identity. A knight without armor wasn't really a knight. He was just an expensively trained man with a horse and some weapons. The armor didn't just protect the body. It protected the social role and self-image that defined knighthood itself. If you thought modern professional equipment was expensive, computers, tools, specialized clothing, medieval armor costs would make you grateful for technological progress. At least modern professional equipment doesn't weigh 70 pounds, require specialized servants to help you use it, and need to be literally beaten back into shape every time you use it for its intended purpose. Let's be honest about the code of chivalry. It was medieval Europe's first attempt at corporate mission statements, and it was about as practically useful as modern mission statements are today. That's right. Chivalry was essentially a marketing campaign designed to make professional violence look noble and morally justified, while simultaneously creating impossible behavioral standards that nobody could actually live up to in real world situations. The basic premise was simple enough. Knights were supposed to be perfect. Christian warriors who protected the innocent, defended the church, showed courtesy to women, and upheld justice at all times. In practice, this meant that knights were expected to be simultaneously brutal killers and gentle gentlemen, ruthless soldiers and pious Christians, loyal vassals and independent moral agents. Sound familiar? It's like being asked to be both. An aggressive salesperson and a caring counselor, depending on what the situation requires, while never acknowledging that these roles might occasionally conflict. To be fair, the development of chivalric codes represented a genuine attempt to civilize medieval warfare and create behavioral standards for the warrior class. Before chivalry became codified, medieval warfare was basically organized thuggery with better equipment. Knights were essentially armed gangs who served whoever paid them the most, and civilian populations had little protection from their predations. The church played a major role in developing chivalric ideals, partly from genuine moral concern, and partly from practical necessity. If you're going to have a society dominated by professional warriors, you need some way to convince them that their violence should serve constructive purposes rather than just personal enrichment. The church's solution was to rebrand knighthood as a sacred calling, complete with religious ceremonies, moral obligations, and the promise of spiritual rewards for proper behavior. Of course, the gap between chivalric theory and medieval reality was roughly equivalent to the gap between a company's mission statement and its actual business practices. Knights were taught to protect the innocent, but they made their livings by collecting taxes from peasants who had no choice but to pay. They were supposed to defend the church, but they regularly fought in wars that had more to do with territorial disputes than religious principles. And they were expected to show courtesy to women while living in a society where women had essentially no legal rights and could be married off as political bargaining chips. Meanwhile, the chivalric emphasis on personal honor created its own problems. In a world where reputation was everything, knights became obsessed with maintaining their honor, even when doing so was stupid, counterproductive, or actively harmful. A knight who backed down from a fight, even when backing down was the smart, tactical choice, could lose his reputation and social standing. This led to situations where knights would charge into obviously hopeless battles rather than be seen as cowards, getting themselves and their followers killed for the sake of maintaining their image. Still, the most problematic aspect of chivalry was probably its treatment of violence itself. The code didn't eliminate violence, it just tried to regulate it and make it seem more noble. Knights were still expected to be killers. They were just supposed to be discriminating about who they killed and why. But in the chaos of actual combat, these fine moral distinctions tended to disappear pretty quickly. If you thought modern workplace ethics training was disconnected from reality, chivalric education was even more divorced from practical considerations. Knights learned elaborate rules about proper conduct toward other knights, how to issue challenges, how to conduct formal duels, how to treat prisoners of war who were also knights. But they received much less guidance about how to deal with non-noble enemies, civilian populations, or the various moral ambiguities that arose in real military campaigns. And yet, despite all these contradictions, chivalric ideals did have some positive effects on medieval society. Knights who took chivalric codes seriously were generally better behaved than those who ignored them entirely. The emphasis on protecting the weak did provide some protection for civilians, even if it wasn't consistently applied. And the ideal of courtly love, however unrealistic, did encourage knights to treat noble women with more respect than they might have otherwise thought to be fair. Many individual knights made genuine efforts to live up to chivalric ideals, even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. The medieval period produced numerous examples of knights who displayed genuine courage, generosity, and moral conviction. But these individual examples shouldn't obscure the fact that the chivalric system as a whole was designed more to justify existing power structures than to create genuine moral reform. The economic realities of knighthood made strict adherence to chivalric codes practically impossible for most knights. When you're struggling to maintain your equipment, pay your debts, and support your household, the fine points of chivalric behavior tend to take a back seat to practical survival. A knight who was too generous to the poor would quickly become poor himself, which wouldn't help anyone in the long run. Meanwhile, the political realities of feudal service meant that knights often had to choose between their chivalric obligations and their feudal duties. When your lord ordered you to participate in a war that was clearly unjust, or to collect taxes from peasants who were already starving, you had to decide whether your loyalty to chivalric ideals was stronger than your practical need to maintain your lord's favor. Most knights, unsurprisingly, chose practical survival over moral consistency. Of course, the chivalric emphasis on romantic love created its own set of problems. The ideal of courtly love, where knights devoted themselves to noble ladies from afar, performing great deeds to win their favor, sounds romantic in theory, but was deeply problematic in practice. It encouraged knights to think of women as objects to be won rather than as individuals with their own agency. And it created a social dynamic where married women were expected to serve as inspiration for other men's romantic fantasies. Still, perhaps the most damaging aspect of chivalry was its tendency to romanticize warfare itself. By presenting military violence as noble and honorable, chivalric culture encouraged young men to seek out opportunities for combat, even when those opportunities were unnecessary or counterproductive. The glorification of martial prowess contributed to a culture where diplomatic solutions were seen as less honorable than military ones, and where political disputes were regularly resolved through violence rather than negotiation. By the late medieval period, chivalric codes had become so elaborate and ritualized that they bore little resemblance to the practical realities of warfare or governance. Knights spent enormous amounts of time and money on tournaments, ceremonies, and other displays of chivalric behavior that had no practical military or political purpose. It was like a massive role-playing game that consumed huge amounts of social resources while producing very little actual benefit for anyone involved. And yet, the influence of chivalric ideals extended far beyond the medieval period. The romantic image of knighthood created by chivalric literature continued to influence European culture for centuries, shaping everything from concepts of gentlemanly behavior to ideas about military honor. Even today, we continue to use chivalric metaphors and imagery when we want to make violence seem noble or justify military actions in moral terms. The legacy of chivalry is thus deeply ambiguous. On one hand, it represented a genuine attempt to create moral standards for the use of violence and to protect the vulnerable members of society. On the other hand, it was primarily a public relations campaign designed to make an inherently brutal and exploitative system seem morally acceptable. Like many medieval institutions, chivalry was simultaneously a force for civilization and a tool for justifying the existing power structure. Let's be clear about it. Medieval warfare. It was nothing like the choreographed sword fights you see in movies and everything, like what would happen if you crossed a rugby match with a construction site accident, while everyone involved was wearing blindfolds and carrying sharp objects. That's right. Actual medieval combat was messy, chaotic, terrifying, and usually decided by factors that had nothing to do with individual skill or courage. If you thought modern warfare was complicated, medieval battles were strategic nightmares, where commanders had essentially no reliable way to communicate with their troops once fighting started, where weather conditions could completely derail the best-laid plans, and where victory often went to whoever made the fewest catastrophic mistakes rather than whoever demonstrated superior tactical brilliance. To be fair, medieval military commanders did develop sophisticated strategies and tactics over time. The period saw genuine innovations in siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and the integration of different types of troops. But all this strategic thinking tended to fall apart pretty quickly once actual fighting started, because medieval battlefields were fundamentally chaotic environments where Murphy's Law reigned supreme. Meanwhile, the individual experience of combat was basically a controlled panic attack while wearing 70 pounds of metal. Your vision was limited by your helmet. Your hearing was muffled by the noise of battle, and you were surrounded by people whose job was to kill you as quickly and efficiently as possible. Imagine trying to perform complex physical tasks while suffering from sensory deprivation and an adrenaline overload that made rational thinking practically impossible. Of course, Hollywood has given us this image of medieval combat as a series of elegant duels between skilled swordsmen, where superior technique and noble spirit triumph over brute force and evil intentions. The reality was more like an extremely violent mosh pit where most people died from being trampled, crushed, or stabbed by someone they never saw coming. Individual sword skills mattered much less than staying upright, staying with your unit, and avoiding the various ways that medieval battlefields could kill you that had nothing to do with enemy action. Sound familiar? It's like the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application in any field. What you learned in training bears only a passing resemblance to what actually happens when you're trying to do the job under real-world conditions. Except in this case, the gap between theory and practice could literally get you killed in the most unpleasant ways medieval technology could devise. And yet, despite all the chaos and horror, medieval warfare did follow certain patterns and conventions. Battles typically began with ranged combat, archers, crossbowmen, and later gunpowder weapons, followed by cavalry charges designed to break enemy formations, and concluded with infantry combat, where the real killing took place. But knowing the general pattern didn't make individual participation any less terrifying or dangerous. The social dynamics of medieval warfare were equally complex. Knights were expected to display courage and skill in combat, but they also had to be careful not to get so carried away with personal glory that they forgot their tactical responsibilities. A knight who charged ahead of his unit to engage in single combat might demonstrate individual courage, but he was also abandoning his men and potentially compromising the entire battle plan. Still, the economic aspects of medieval warfare were often more important than the military ones. Most medieval wars were fought over resources, land, trade routes, taxation rights, rather than abstract principles or religious beliefs. Knights might talk about honor and glory, but they were usually fighting to maintain or improve their economic position within the feudal system. If you thought modern military logistics were complicated, medieval campaign logistics were genuinely nightmarish. Armies had to carry or acquire everything they needed to survive: food, water, weapons, equipment, medical supplies, while moving through hostile territory, where local populations were actively trying to hide or destroy anything useful. Most medieval armies spent more time dealing with supply problems than actually fighting battles. Meanwhile, the seasonal nature of medieval warfare meant that campaigns were largely limited to the months when weather conditions allowed large-scale troop movements, and when agricultural demands didn't require knights to be managing their own estates. This created a rhythm where wars tended to follow predictable patterns, with major military activity concentrated in the summer and fall months. To be fair, medieval military technology did produce some genuinely impressive innovations. The development of the heavy cavalry charge as a battlefield tactic was a significant military advance that dominated European warfare for several centuries. Medieval siege engines, from catapults to trebuchets to early cannons, represented sophisticated engineering solutions to complex military problems. But technological advances also created new problems. Better armor led to the development of better armor-piercing weapons. Improvements in fortification design led to innovations in siege warfare. Each advance in military technology triggered counter-advances that made warfare more complex, more expensive, and often more deadly for everyone involved. Of course, the psychological aspects of medieval combat shouldn't be underestimated. Fighting hand-to-hand with edged weapons requires a level of psychological commitment that's difficult for modern people to imagine. You had to be willing to physically attack other human beings at close range, using tools designed to cause maximum damage. This kind of combat selected for individuals who were either naturally aggressive or who had been conditioned to overcome their natural reluctance to violence. Meanwhile, the aftermath of medieval battles was genuinely horrific. Medieval medical knowledge was primitive, so wounded soldiers often died from infections that would be easily treatable today. Battlefield medical care consisted mainly of basic wound cleaning and amputation of damaged limbs. The survival rate for serious wounds was not encouraging, which meant that many knights who survived the actual fighting died days or weeks later from medical complications. And yet, perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of medieval warfare was its unpredictability. A knight could spend years preparing for battle, invest enormous amounts of money in equipment and training, demonstrate genuine skill and courage in combat, and still die from a random arrow shot by a peasant archer who barely knew how to use his weapon. Success in medieval warfare depended as much on luck as on skill, which made it a particularly cruel way to make a living. Still, medieval warfare did produce some genuine heroes, individuals who displayed extraordinary courage, skill, and leadership under impossible conditions. The period saw numerous examples of knights who lived up to the martial ideals of their culture and made significant contributions to military history. But for every famous knight whose name we remember, there were hundreds of others who died anonymously in forgotten battles over causes that seemed important at the time, but proved meaningless in the long run. The development of gunpowder weapons gradually changed the nature of medieval warfare, making individual martial skill less important and professional armies more effective than fuel levies. This technological shift ultimately undermined the military relevance of knighthood. but it took several centuries for the full implications to become clear. Knights adapted to new military technologies as best they could, but the fundamental basis of their military dominance was slowly being eroded by forces beyond their control. By the end of the medieval period, warfare had become so complex and expensive that it was beyond the resources of individual knights or even small groups of knights. Professional armies, artillery, and sophisticated fortifications required the resources of entire kingdoms to develop and maintain. This shift towards centralized military power marked the beginning of the end for the feudal system and the military dominance of the knightly class. Let's be honest about the economics of knighthood. It was like running a small business where your primary asset could literally get you killed. Your operating expenses were astronomical. Your income was unpredictable. And your main customers had a tendency to default on their payments by dying in wars. That's right. Being a knight was essentially medieval entrepreneurship with swords. And the failure rate was about what you'd expect from combining business ownership with professional violence. If you thought modern small business owners had cash flow problems, medieval knights faced financial challenges that would make a startup founder weep with empathy. Your initial investment, horse, armor, weapons, training, cost more than most people made in their entire lives. Your ongoing expenses, equipment maintenance, horse care, household expenses, military obligations were enormous and non-negotiable. And your primary source of income depended on a feudal system that was basically a pyramid scheme with extra steps and significantly more opportunities for violent death. To be fair, successful knights could achieve considerable wealth and social status. Land ownership provided a steady income from agricultural rents, and military success could lead to additional grants of territory, treasure from ransoms, or lucrative positions in royal service. But the keyword here, successful, and success in medieval knighthood, depended on so many variables beyond your control that it was essentially a very expensive form of gambling. Meanwhile, the basic economics of feudal service meant that knights were caught in a financial bind that would make modern gig economy workers look financially secure. You owed military service to your lord in exchange for your land grants, but military service was expensive. Every campaign required you to provide your own equipment, food, and transportation, plus often contributions to your lord's war chest. Sound familiar? It's like being required to work for your employer while paying your own salary and providing your own equipment. Of course, the feudal system was theoretically designed to provide knights with the resources they needed to fulfill their military obligations. Land grants were supposed to generate enough income to cover the costs of knightly service, and the system included various arrangements for sharing expenses and supporting knights who couldn't afford their full obligations. In practice, however, the system worked much less smoothly than the theory suggested. Agricultural income was notoriously unpredictable. Bad weather, crop diseases, warfare, and economic disruptions could dramatically reduce a knight's income in any given year. Meanwhile, military obligations didn't disappear just because you were having financial difficulties. If your lord called for service, you were expected to show up properly equipped and ready to fight, regardless of whether you could actually afford to do so. And yet, the social pressure to maintain appearances meant that knights often went into debt rather than appear unable to fulfill their obligations. A knight who showed up for military service with outdated equipment or a mediocre horse was advertising his financial difficulties to his peers, which could damage his reputation and reduce his future opportunities. Better to borrow money and hope that the next campaign would provide enough plunder or ransoms to pay off your debts. Still, the most economically devastating aspect of knighthood was probably the arms race in military equipment. As armor and weapons technology advanced, knights were under constant pressure to upgrade their gear or risk becoming militarily obsolete. But each new generation of equipment was more expensive than the last, and there was no trade-in value for your old gear. Outdated military equipment was essentially worthless. If you thought keeping up with modern technology was expensive, medieval military technology upgrades would bankrupt you. A new suit of plate armor could cost as much as a small estate, and it needed to be custom fitted by skilled craftsmen who charged premium rates for their services. Weapons, horses, and supporting equipment added additional costs that could easily exceed a knight's annual income from land rents. Meanwhile, the maintenance costs for knightly equipment were genuinely staggering. Horses required constant care, feeding, and replacement. A good warhorse lived maybe 10 years under the best of circumstances, and much less if it saw regular combat. Armor needed frequent cleaning, repair, and adjustment. Weapons wore out and needed to be replaced or reforged. It was like owning a luxury car that you had to drive through demolition derbies on a regular basis. To be fair, knights did have various strategies for managing their financial obligations. Wealthy knights often supported less wealthy knights in exchange for service, creating a kind of military patronage system. Knights could earn money through tournaments, where successful competitors won prizes and attracted paying students. And military campaigns, despite their expenses, could provide significant income through ransoms, plunder, and grants of land from grateful lords. But all of these income sources were fundamentally uncertain. Tournament success depended on skill, luck, and not being seriously injured by your competitors. Military campaigns could just as easily result in financial ruin as in wealth. If you were captured, you'd have to pay your own ransom. And if your side lost, you might lose your lands as well. Even patronage relationships were risky because they depended on the continued success and goodwill of your patron. Of course, the social obligations of knighthood created additional financial pressures that had nothing to do with military service. Knights were expected to maintain households appropriate to their status, which meant employing servants, entertaining guests, and providing hospitality on a scale that could quickly become ruinously expensive. A knight who was too obviously economical in his lifestyle would lose social status, but a knight who spent too freely would quickly go bankrupt. Sound familiar? It's like modern social media pressure to maintain an expensive lifestyle, except in the medieval period, your lifestyle choices had direct implications for your professional opportunities and personal safety. A knight who couldn't afford to maintain his social obligations would find himself increasingly isolated from the networks of mutual support that made survival possible in a dangerous world. Meanwhile, the legal system provided very little protection for knights who got into financial difficulties. Medieval bankruptcy laws were primitive or non-existent, and debt collection often involved armed force. A knight who couldn't pay his debts might find himself facing challenges to combat, or even having his land seized by creditors. The same martial skills that define knighthood could be turned against knights who failed to meet their financial obligations. And yet, despite all these financial pressures, many knights managed to achieve and maintain considerable prosperity. The key was usually diversification. Successful knights didn't rely solely on feudal service or military income, but developed multiple income streams through land management, trade relationships, political appointments, and strategic marriages. The most successful knights were essentially medieval investment portfolio managers who happened to carry swords. Still, the fundamental problem with the economics of knighthood was that it required enormous upfront investments with no guarantee of return. Unlike modern professions, where training costs are relatively predictable and career advancement follows somewhat rational patterns, knighthood was essentially a high-stakes gamble where the house always had better odds than the players. By the later medieval period, the economic pressures of knighthood had become so severe that many eligible men simply chose not to become knights. The costs exceeded the benefits for anyone who wasn't already wealthy, and even wealthy families were sometimes reluctant to invest in knightly careers for their sons. This led to a gradual decline in the number of active knights and contributed to the transformation of knighthood from a military profession into a largely ceremonial social status. Of course, the economic difficulties of individual knights were part of larger changes in medieval society and economy. The rise of professional armies, improvements in military technology, and the development of more sophisticated financial systems all contributed to making traditional knighthood economically obsolete. Knights who adapted to these changes could continue to prosper, but those who clung to traditional approaches often found themselves financially ruined. The legacy of knightly economics is still visible today in the way we think about professional military service and the relationship between social status and financial obligation. The idea that certain professions carry special social responsibilities that may conflict with personal financial interests, and that society should honor these sacrifices, traces its roots back to medieval knighthood, even though the specific economic arrangements have changed dramatically. Let's be clear about medieval castle life. It was less romantic fairy tale setting and more expensive, drafty, unsanitary compound where privacy didn't exist. Comfort was a foreign concept, and your neighbors were armed and potentially homicidal. That's right. Living in a medieval castle was like being trapped in a combination of a maximum security prison, a dysfunctional office building, and a camping trip that never ended. Except the camping trip involved stone floors, minimal heating, and the constant possibility of siege warfare. If you thought modern apartment living had privacy issues, medieval castles would make you grateful for thin walls and noisy neighbors. Castles were designed for defense, not comfort, which meant that personal space was essentially non-existent. Knights typically shared large halls with dozens of other people, sleeping on straw mattresses that were moved around as needed. Private bedrooms were rare and usually reserved for the most important residents. Everyone else made do with whatever space they could find, often sharing beds with people they barely knew. To be fair, castles did provide impressive security against external threats. The massive stone walls, defensive towers, and elaborate gate systems made medieval castles nearly impregnable to direct assault. For knights living in unstable political situations, this security was literally a matter of life and death. But the same features that made castles defensible also made them deeply unpleasant places to live on a daily basis. Meanwhile, the basic living conditions in medieval castles would make modern camping look luxurious. Stone walls and floors provided no insulation against cold or dampness. Heating was provided by fireplaces that were smoky, inefficient, and dangerous. Castle fires were a constant hazard that could destroy years of accumulated wealth in a matter of hours. Windows were small and often unglazed, letting in cold air and precipitation while providing minimal light. Of course, sanitation in medieval castles was a subject that Disney movies carefully avoid discussing. Toilets, when they existed at all, were basically holes in the wall that dropped waste into moats or rivers. Privacy for bodily functions was minimal or non-existent. Bathing was infrequent and usually involved sharing water with other people. The smell in medieval castles was apparently quite distinctive, combining unwashed human bodies, food waste, animal waste, and various other aromatic elements that would violate multiple modern health codes. Sound familiar? It's like living in a college dormitory, except the dormitory is made of stone. There's no central heating or plumbing, and some of your roommates are professional killers who settle disputes with swords. And unlike college, you couldn't graduate and move out after 4 years. For many knights, castle life was a permanent arrangement that lasted until death. Still, Castle life did offer some advantages that were significant by medieval standards. Castles provided protection not just from military attacks, but from bandits, wild animals, and other hazards of medieval life. They served as centers of local administration and justice, giving residents access to legal protections that weren't available to people living in isolated rural areas. And they offered opportunities for social interaction and cultural activities that were rare in medieval society. If you thought modern office politics were complicated, medieval castle politics would drive you to drink, which, fortunately, was one of the few recreational activities readily available in castle settings. Castles were essentially small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, where social hierarchies were rigid and constantly reinforced, and where personal conflicts could easily escalate into violence. Managing relationships with dozens of armed, ego-driven individuals while living in close quarters required diplomatic skills that would impress modern UN peacekeepers. And yet, despite all the discomfort and social tension, many knights preferred castle life to the alternatives. Rural manor houses offered more privacy and comfort, but much less security. Urban residences provided better access to trade and cultural amenities, but exposed knights to different kinds of political and economic risks. For knights whose primary concern was survival in a violent world, the security advantages of castle life often outweighed the lifestyle disadvantages. Meanwhile, the economic aspects of castle life created additional complications. Maintaining a castle required enormous ongoing expenses for repairs, supplies, and garrison wages. Knights who owned castles often spent the majority of their income just keeping their fortifications in good repair. Those who lived in castles owned by others had to navigate complex obligations and dependencies that could limit their personal freedom and financial flexibility. To be fair, castle life wasn't uniformly miserable for everyone involved. High-ranking knights and nobles often had access to better accommodations, more privacy, and superior food and entertainment. Castle libraries, when they existed, provided access to books and learning that were otherwise rare in medieval society. And castles served as venues for tournaments, feasts, and other social events that broke up the monotony of daily life. But even the best castle accommodations were primitive by modern standards. The concept of personal hygiene was rudimentary. Medical care was based on superstition and guesswork, and entertainment options were limited to whatever could be organized locally with available resources. Reading was a luxury available only to the literate minority, and even they were limited to whatever manuscripts happened to be available in the castle library. Of course, the seasonal nature of medieval life meant that castle conditions varied dramatically throughout the year. Winter was particularly harsh, with inadequate heating, limited food preservation, and minimal opportunities for outdoor activities. Summer brought relief from cold, but introduced problems with food spoilage, insect infestations, and the various health hazards associated with poor sanitation in warm weather. Still, perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of castle life was the social isolation. Despite being constantly surrounded by other people, knights often found themselves cut off from family, friends, and familiar surroundings for months or years at a time. The combination of physical discomfort, social tension, and emotional isolation created conditions that would probably qualify as psychological torture by modern standards. Meanwhile, the gender dynamics of castle life created additional complications. Medieval castles were predominantly male environments where women's roles were limited and closely supervised. Female residents, wives, daughters, servants, lived under constant scrutiny and had minimal personal autonomy. For male knights, this meant that normal romantic and family relationships were complicated by the artificial social environment of castle life. And yet, Castles did serve important cultural functions that extended beyond their military and administrative purposes. They preserved and transmitted medieval culture, serving as centers for music, literature, and artistic production. Castle. Schools trained young nobles in the skills and knowledge necessary for their social roles. And castle chapels provided religious services and moral guidance that helped maintain social cohesion in challenging circumstances dot by the later medieval period. Castle design began to evolve toward greater comfort and privacy, reflecting changes in social expectations and military technology. The development of gunpowder weapons made traditional castle fortifications less effective, while improvements in royal authority and legal systems reduced the need for private military strongholds. This led to a gradual transformation of castles from purely military installations into more comfortable residential complexes. But for most of the medieval period, castle life remained a challenging compromise between security and comfort, where the demands of defense took priority over personal convenience. Knights who lived in castles accepted these conditions as the price of survival in a dangerous world. But few would have chosen such accommodations if safer alternatives had been available. The romantic image of castle life as elegant and refined is largely a later invention that bears little resemblance to medieval reality. Let's be honest about medieval marriage for knights. It was less romantic partnership based on mutual affection, and more business merger with sexual obligations and potentially deadly political implications. That's right, when medieval knights got married, they weren't just choosing life partners. They were entering into complex economic and political agreements that could determine their family's survival for generations, often with people they'd never met before the wedding day. If you thought modern dating was complicated, medieval marriage arrangements would make you grateful for dating apps and the freedom to choose your own romantic disasters. Knights rarely married for love. They married for land, political alliance, economic advantage, or family obligation. The concept of marrying someone because you enjoyed their company was considered a dangerous luxury that most knights simply couldn't afford. To be fair, some medieval marriages did develop into genuine partnerships based on mutual respect and affection. When two people are stuck together for life in challenging circumstances, they sometimes find ways to make the relationship work on a personal level. But this was essentially a happy accident in a system designed to serve political and economic purposes rather than personal fulfillment. Meanwhile, the economics of medieval marriage were genuinely complex. Marriages involved dowries, inheritance rights, property transfers, and various financial obligations that could take years to negotiate. A knight's choice of bride could determine whether his family prospered or went bankrupt, whether his children inherited significant lands or struggled in poverty, and whether his political alliances strengthened or weakened his position in local and national politics. Of course, the social pressure to marry strategically was enormous. A knight who married poorly, someone without adequate lands, connections, or dowry, would face criticism from his family, his peers, and his social superiors. But a knight who married too far above his station might find himself dominated by his wife's family or unable to fulfill the financial obligations that came with an advantageous marriage. Sound familiar? It's like modern networking and career advancement, except instead of LinkedIn connections and professional relationships, you're talking about literally sleeping with people to advance your political and economic interests. And unlike modern networking, medieval marriage was generally permanent. Divorce was difficult or impossible, so choosing the wrong partner could ruin your entire life. And yet, despite all the strategic considerations, knights were still human. Beings with normal human desires for companionship, affection, and physical intimacy. This created inevitable tensions between practical necessity and personal feelings. Knights who married for strategic reasons often sought emotional fulfillment elsewhere, leading to adultery, scandal, and sometimes violence when romantic entanglements conflicted with political obligations. Still, the chivalric ideal of courtly love provided a socially acceptable outlet for romantic feelings that couldn't be expressed within marriage. Knights were encouraged to develop intense, idealized attachments to noble ladies, preferably married ladies, who were safely unavailable for actual romantic relationships. This allowed knights to experience and express romantic emotions without disrupting the political and economic arrangements that governed their actual marriages. If you thought modern relationship advice was confusing, medieval courtly love literature would leave you completely baffled. Knights were supposed to worship their chosen ladies from afar, perform great deeds to win their favor, and remain eternally devoted while never actually consummating the relationship. It was like a medieval version of celebrity crush culture. Except your celebrity crush might actually acknowledge your existence and occasionally give you tokens of favor that you could wear into battle. Meanwhile, the practical realities of medieval married life were often quite different from both the strategic planning and the romantic idealization. Knights and their wives lived in close quarters with minimal privacy, dealing with the daily challenges of medieval life while navigating complex relationships with in-laws, children, servants, and political allies. Many medieval marriages seem to have settled into working partnerships, where couples divided responsibilities and supported each other's practical goals, even if they never developed deep emotional connections. To be fair, medieval marriage did offer some advantages that are often overlooked. Married knights had partners who could manage their households, raise their children, and represent their interests when they were away on military campaigns or political business. Medieval wives, despite their limited legal rights, often wielded considerable practical authority within their domestic spheres and could be valuable advisors and allies for their husbands. But the legal framework of medieval marriage was heavily biased against women, giving wives minimal protection against abusive or neglectful husbands. Women's property rights were limited. Their ability to make independent decisions was restricted, and their primary social value was often measured by their ability to produce male heirs. For knights, this meant that marriage provided significant advantages but also created ongoing obligations and potential sources of conflict. Of course, the reproductive expectations placed on medieval couples were enormous by modern standards. Producing legitimate male heirs was essential for maintaining family lands and political position, but medieval infant and child mortality rates meant that couples needed to have many children to ensure that some survived to adulthood. This placed considerable physical and emotional stress on medieval women and created ongoing anxiety for knights about the continuation of their family lines. Meanwhile, the intersection of marriage and military service created unique challenges for medieval knights. Long campaigns meant extended separations from their families, making it difficult to maintain close relationships or manage domestic affairs. Knights' wives had to be prepared to manage estates, raise children, and deal with various emergencies while their husbands were away, often for months or years at a time. And yet, despite all these challenges, many medieval marriages seem to have functioned reasonably well within the constraints of their historical context. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that medieval couples often developed effective partnerships that allowed them to navigate the complex demands of their social positions while maintaining stable family relationships. Still, most tragic aspect of medieval marriage was probably the limited opportunities for personal fulfillment that it offered to both partners. Knights who married for strategic reasons often spent their entire lives in relationships that provided economic and political benefits, but little emotional satisfaction. Medieval wives were often educated and intelligent women who were restricted to domestic roles that didn't fully utilize their capabilities or interests. By the later medieval period, changing economic conditions and social attitudes began to create more opportunities for marriages based on personal choice and mutual affection. The rise of urban merchant classes, improvements in women's legal rights, and the development of more sophisticated financial systems all contributed to making strategic marriage less essential for social survival. But throughout most of the medieval period, marriage remained primarily a political and economic institution rather than a romantic one. Knights who expected their marriages to provide personal happiness in addition to strategic advantages were often disappointed, while those who approached marriage as a practical arrangement were sometimes pleasantly surprised when their relationships developed into something more personally meaningful. The legacy of medieval marriage patterns continues to influence modern ideas about the relationship between love, politics, and economic security. The tension between romantic ideals and practical necessities that characterize medieval knighthood remains a feature of many modern relationships, even though the specific constraints and pressures have changed dramatically over the centuries. Let's be clear about medieval healthcare. It was like playing Russian roulette with a six-shooter, where 5 chambers were loaded and the one empty chamber was labeled, "Maybe prayer will help." That's right. Being a knight in medieval times meant accepting that any injury, illness, or infection could be a death sentence, treated by medical practitioners whose understanding of human anatomy was roughly equivalent to a modern third grader's knowledge of rocket science. If you thought waiting in modern emergency rooms was frustrating, medieval medical care would make you grateful for even the most overworked, understaffed hospital. Medieval physicians based their treatments on a combination of ancient Greek theories, religious beliefs, astrological calculations, and folk remedies that had been passed down through generations without any systematic testing or verification. The concept of evidence-based medicine wouldn't be invented for several more centuries, leaving medieval patients to hope that their doctor's confidence would compensate for their complete lack of actual medical knowledge. To be fair, medieval physicians weren't intentionally incompetent. They were working with the best information available to them at the time. The problem was that most of this information was wrong, and medieval society lacked the scientific methods necessary to distinguish between effective treatments and elaborate forms of expensive quackery. This meant that wealthy patients often received more elaborate and therefore more dangerous treatments than poor patients who couldn't afford professional medical care. Meanwhile, the occupational hazards of knighthood meant that knights were constantly exposed to injuries and conditions that would challenge even modern medical care. Sword wounds, arrow injuries, broken bones from falls, concussions from blunt trauma, infections from dirty weapons, and various other forms of combat-related damage required immediate treatment under field conditions by people who had minimal medical training and essentially no understanding of infection control. Of course, medieval battlefield medicine was basically first aid performed by people who thought that bleeding was a good way to treat most medical conditions. Battle surgeons did their best to clean wounds, set broken bones, and amputate damaged limbs. But they had no understanding of antiseptics, anesthetics, or the importance of sterilizing surgical instruments. Many knights who survived their initial injuries died days or weeks later from infections that would be easily preventable with modern medical knowledge. Sound familiar? It's like getting surgery from someone who learned their medical techniques by watching YouTube videos. Except the YouTube videos were written in Latin by people who died 1,000 years ago and were wrong about most things to begin with. And instead of medical malpractice lawsuits, unsuccessful treatments were attributed to God's will, the patient's moral failings, or unfavorable astrological conditions. And yet, despite the primitive state of medical knowledge, medieval physicians did develop some treatments that were genuinely effective. They learned to set broken bones, suture wounds, and perform basic surgical procedures. Some herbal remedies actually worked. Willow bark, for example, contains compounds similar to modern aspirin. And medieval hospitals, often run by religious orders, provided care for the sick and injured that was better than nothing, even if it wasn't particularly good by modern standards. Still, the most dangerous aspect of medieval medicine was probably the physician's confidence in treatments that were actively harmful. Bloodletting, deliberately draining blood from patients, was considered a cure for almost everything, despite the fact that it weakened patients and made them more vulnerable to infection. Mercury, lead, and various other toxic substances were commonly used as medicines, and surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or proper sterilization, making them almost as likely to kill patients as to cure them. If you thought modern medical bills were expensive, medieval medical care would bankrupt you just as effectively while providing much less benefit. Wealthy patients paid enormous fees for elaborate treatments that often made their conditions worse. The most expensive medical care involved rare imported ingredients, complex procedures, and consultations with multiple physicians, all of which increased the cost without improving the outcomes. Meanwhile, the religious aspects of medieval medicine created additional complications. Physicians were supposed to treat the soul as well as the body, which meant that medical treatment often included confession, prayer, and various religious observances. Patients were expected to demonstrate proper faith and moral behavior as part of their recovery process, and unsuccessful treatments were sometimes attributed to spiritual rather than medical factors thought to be fair. The medieval period did see some genuine advances in medical knowledge and practice. Islamic physicians made significant contributions to anatomy, surgery, and pharmacology that gradually spread to European medical practice. Medieval hospitals developed systematic approaches to patient care that were improvements over earlier practices, and some medieval physicians did attempt to observe and record the effects of different treatments, laying groundwork for later scientific approaches to medicine. But for individual knights dealing with combat injuries, illness, or chronic health conditions, medieval medicine offered more hope than actual help. A knight who was seriously wounded in battle faced a grim choice between dying quickly from his injuries or dying slowly from the infections that would almost certainly follow any attempt at medical treatment. Many knights probably chose to tough out minor injuries rather than seek medical care that might make things worse. Of course, the social status of knights did provide some advantages in terms of medical care. Knights could afford professional physicians, access to important medicines, and treatment in the best available medical facilities. But these advantages were relative. The best medieval medical care was still primitive by modern standards, and wealth couldn't compensate for the fundamental limitations of medieval medical knowledge. Meanwhile, the psychological aspects of dealing with medieval medical conditions were genuinely traumatic. Knights lived with the constant awareness that any injury or illness could be fatal, and that medical treatment might be more dangerous than the original condition. This uncertainty affected everything from military tactics to daily life decisions, as knights tried to balance the risks of their profession against the limited medical resources available to deal with the consequences. And yet, despite all these medical challenges, many knights did live to relatively old age, at least by medieval standards. Those who survived their initial military service, avoided serious injuries, and had some degree of luck with infections and diseases could sometimes live into their 50s or 60s. But this survival was more a matter of luck and good genes than effective medical care. Still, the most sobering aspect of medieval medicine was how it affected knights' families. Childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous for medieval women, with maternal mortality rates that would be considered catastrophic. By modern standards, infant and child mortality was so common that parents often didn't name their children until they were several years old and had demonstrated that they might actually survive. For knights, this meant that maintaining family lines required having many children and accepting that most of them might not survive to adulthood. By the later medieval period, improvements in medical knowledge and practice began to make healthcare somewhat more effective and less actively dangerous. The development of medical schools, the translation of important medical texts, and the gradual accumulation of practical experience all contributed to better medical outcomes. But these improvements came too late to help most medieval knights, who lived and died under medical conditions that were only marginally better than no medical care at all. The legacy of medieval medicine's limitations helps explain why medieval people often seemed fatalistic about health and mortality. When medical care was unreliable and often dangerous, it made sense to focus on spiritual preparation for death rather than aggressive attempts at medical treatment. This attitude influenced everything from military tactics to family planning, as medieval knights learned to live with levels of medical uncertainty that would be unacceptable in modern society. Let's be honest about medieval food. It was like playing culinary roulette, where half the options would give you food poisoning, a quarter would taste like cardboard soaked in grease, and the remaining quarter might actually be edible if you were desperate enough or drunk enough to ignore the questionable ingredients. That's right. Being a knight meant dealing with a diet that would make modern prison food look like fine dining, all while maintaining the energy needed for combat and the social obligations of appearing well-fed and prosperous. If you thought modern food safety regulations were annoying, medieval food preparation would make you weep with gratitude for health inspectors and expiration dates. Medieval cooks had no understanding of bacteria, foodborne illness, or proper preservation techniques beyond salting, smoking, and hoping for the best. Meat was often stored until it was borderline rotten, then disguised with expensive spices that cost more than most people's annual income. Fresh vegetables were seasonal luxuries, and anything that couldn't be preserved for winter consumption was basically unavailable for half the year. To be fair, wealthy knights did have access to better food than most medieval people. They could afford meat on a regular basis, imported spices to make questionable ingredients more palatable, and professional cooks who at least knew the difference between edible and poisonous plants. But even the best medieval cuisine was primitive by modern standards, lacking basic knowledge about nutrition, food safety, and cooking techniques that we take for granted today. Meanwhile, the social aspects of medieval dining created their own set of problems. Knights were expected to host elaborate feasts to demonstrate their wealth and status. But these events were exercises in competitive consumption that could bankrupt smaller households. The pressure to serve exotic, expensive foods meant that knights often went into debt to maintain their reputation as generous hosts, while simultaneously risking food poisoning from dishes that were more about showing off than providing actual nutrition. Of course, the practical realities of medieval food storage meant that knights' diets varied dramatically with the seasons. Summer and fall provided fresh fruits, vegetables, and newly slaughtered meat. Winter meant surviving on preserved foods that had been salted, dried, or pickled months earlier and had often deteriorated significantly in storage. Spring was traditionally the most dangerous time, when stored food supplies were running low and fresh crops hadn't yet matured, leading to what was politely called the hungry season, but was basically controlled starvation for anyone who hadn't planned ahead carefully. Sound familiar? It's like meal planning for a camping trip that lasts 6 months, except you can't just drive to a grocery store when you run out of supplies. And if you miscalculate your food needs, you might literally starve to death. And unlike modern camping, medieval food preservation didn't include refrigeration, vacuum sealing, or any of the other technologies that make long-term food storage relatively reliable. And yet, despite all these limitations, medieval cuisine did develop some genuinely impressive techniques for making the best of limited resources. Medieval cooks learned to maximize the use of every part of animals, created complex preservation methods that allowed certain foods to last for months, and developed sophisticated spice blends that could make even questionable ingredients taste acceptable. The medieval period saw the development of many cooking techniques and recipes that influenced European cuisine for centuries. Still, the most challenging aspect of medieval dining was probably the complete lack of understanding about nutrition and health. Medieval physicians recommended diets based on ancient Greek theories about balancing bodily humors rather than actual nutritional science. This led to some truly bizarre dietary advice. Physicians might recommend avoiding fruits and vegetables, while encouraging the consumption of wine and red meat for patients who were obviously suffering from malnutrition. If you thought modern fad diets were based on questionable science, medieval dietary theory would leave you completely baffled. Physicians believed that different foods had inherent hot or cold, wet or dry properties that needed to be balanced according to individual temperament and astrological conditions. A knight with a sanguine temperament might be advised to avoid hot foods like garlic and pepper, while someone with a melancholic disposition should supposedly consume warming foods and avoid anything cold or wet. Meanwhile, the economic aspects of medieval food created additional pressures for knights. Good food was expensive, and maintaining a diet appropriate to knightly status required significant financial resources. Knights who couldn't afford proper food faced social embarrassment and potential health problems, but knights who spent too much on elaborate meals could quickly bankrupt themselves. It was another impossible balancing act between social expectations and financial reality. To be fair, medieval feasts could be genuinely impressive social events that served important political and cultural functions. Large dinners provided opportunities for diplomacy, alliance building, and information sharing that were essential for medieval political life. The elaborate rituals surrounding formal meals helped reinforce social hierarchies and cultural values. And successful feast-giving could enhance a knight's reputation and create valuable social connections. But the preparation and execution of medieval feasts required enormous amounts of time, labor, and resources that diverted attention from other important activities. Knights who became too focused on entertaining could neglect their military training, estate management, or political obligations. And the competitive nature of medieval hospitality created pressure to constantly escalate the expense and elaborateness of social events. Of course, the health consequences of medieval diets were significant, even for wealthy knights who could afford the best available food. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables during winter months led to vitamin deficiencies that caused various health problems. The emphasis on meat and alcohol in knightly diets contributed to gout, kidney problems, and other conditions that were common among the medieval nobility. And the general lack of understanding about balanced nutrition meant that even knights who ate expensive food were often malnourished in subtle ways. Meanwhile, food-related illnesses were a constant hazard that could incapacitate or kill knights without warning. Food poisoning from spoiled meat or contaminated water was common, and medieval medical care was more likely to make digestive problems worse than better. Knights had to develop strong stomachs and hope for the best, knowing that any meal might be their last, not because of enemy action, but because of bacterial contamination. And yet, despite all these challenges, medieval knights did manage to maintain reasonably functional diets that provided enough energy for their demanding lifestyle. The emphasis on meat protein helped support the physical demands of combat and training, while the social aspects of dining provided important psychological benefits in an otherwise harsh and stressful existence. Still, perhaps the most frustrating aspect of medieval food was how it reinforced social inequalities in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Knights ate meat, while peasants ate bread and porridge. Knights had access to imported spices, while commoners made do with local herbs. Knights could afford to discard food that was merely unappetizing, while peasants had to eat whatever they could get, regardless of quality or taste. By the later medieval period, improvements in trade, agriculture, and food preservation began to make better nutrition more widely available. The development of better cooking techniques, the introduction of new crops, and improvements in food storage all contributed to making medieval diets somewhat more reliable and nutritious. But these advances came too late to help most medieval knights, who spent their careers dealing with food systems that were only marginally better than subsistence-level nutrition. The legacy of medieval food culture helps explain many aspects of modern cuisine, from our emphasis on meat as a status symbol to our use of expensive spices as markers of sophistication. The competitive aspects of medieval entertaining continue to influence how we think about hospitality and social obligations, even though the specific foods and preparation methods have changed dramatically over the centuries. Let's be clear about medieval travel. It was like taking a cross-country road trip in a vehicle with no suspension, no air conditioning, no GPS, and a significant chance of being murdered by bandits before you reached your destination. That's right, knights who needed to travel for military campaigns, political obligations, or personal business faced a transportation system that made modern airline delays look like minor inconveniences compared to the medieval reality of spending weeks on muddy roads while wearing armor and hoping not to die from exposure, disease, or violence. If you thought modern traffic jams were frustrating, medieval travel would make you grateful for even the most congested highway system. Medieval roads were basically dirt paths that became muddy nightmares during rain, dusty hellscapes during dry weather, and impassable obstacles during winter. There were no road maintenance crews, no traffic laws, and no emergency services. Just you, your horse, and whatever supplies you could carry, trying to navigate between destinations that might be hundreds of miles apart through territory controlled by people who might or might not want to kill you. To be fair, the Roman Empire had built an impressive network of roads throughout Europe, and some of these were still usable during the medieval period. But Roman road maintenance required the resources of a unified empire with professional engineering corps and massive slave labor forces. Medieval kingdoms lacked both the resources and the political organization necessary to maintain complex infrastructure projects, so most Roman roads gradually deteriorated into barely passable tracks. Meanwhile, the security situation on medieval roads was genuinely terrifying. Bandits, brigands, and various other armed groups operated along major travel routes, targeting merchants, pilgrims, and anyone else who looked like they might be carrying valuable goods. Knights traveling alone or in small groups were particularly attractive targets, since their equipment and horses were worth enormous amounts of money to anyone desperate or violent enough to try to take them. Of course, the practical challenges of medieval travel went far beyond the security risks. Horses required constant care, feeding, and rest. You couldn't just fuel up at a gas station and drive for 8 hours straight. A typical day's travel might cover 20 to 30 miles under good conditions, meaning that long-distance journeys required weeks or months of careful planning and considerable financial resources for supplies, lodging, and emergencies. Sound familiar? It's like planning a camping trip where you have to carry everything you need for weeks of outdoor living, except you also have to worry about armed robbers, hostile weather, disease, and the constant possibility that your transportation will break down or die in the middle of nowhere. And unlike modern camping, there were no park rangers, emergency services, or cell phone coverage to help if things went wrong. And yet, despite all these challenges, medieval knights did travel extensively. For military campaigns, diplomatic missions, pilgrimages, and personal business. The medieval period saw considerable movement of people, ideas, and goods across Europe, facilitated by networks of roads, bridges, ferries, and lodging facilities that developed to serve the needs of travelers who had no other choice but to endure the hardships of medieval transportation. Still, the most dangerous aspect of medieval travel was probably the complete lack of reliable information about road conditions, weather, or political situations along your route. Modern travelers can check traffic reports, weather forecasts, and travel advisories before leaving home. Medieval travelers basically had to guess about what they might encounter and hope that local conditions hadn't changed dramatically since the last traveler passed through the area. If you thought modern travel planning was complicated, medieval journey preparation would overwhelm you with its complexity and uncertainty. Knights had to plan for every conceivable emergency: bad weather, equipment failures, illness, injury, bandit attacks, political complications, and various other hazards that could turn a routine trip into a life-threatening disaster. The amount of supplies, equipment, and money required for long-distance travel was genuinely staggering. Meanwhile, the seasonal nature of medieval travel created additional complications. Winter travel was extremely dangerous due to weather conditions, reduced daylight hours, and the difficulty of finding adequate shelter and supplies. Spring travel was complicated by muddy roads and flooding rivers. Summer provided the best travel conditions, but also the highest risk of encountering military campaigns, brigands, and other travelers competing for limited resources along popular routes. To be fair, medieval travel did offer some advantages that are often overlooked. The slower pace allowed travelers to observe and appreciate landscapes in ways that aren't possible with modern high-speed transportation. Medieval travelers often developed detailed knowledge of local geography, customs, and politics that proved valuable in their professional and personal lives. And the shared hardships of medieval travel created social bonds between travelers that could last for years. But the psychological stress of medieval travel was genuinely traumatic by modern standards. Knights had to maintain constant vigilance against threats while dealing with physical discomfort, social isolation, and uncertainty about when they would reach their destinations or whether they would arrive safely. The combination of physical hardship and psychological pressure created conditions that would probably qualify as torture by modern standards. Of course, wealthy knights could afford better travel accommodations than most medieval people. They could stay in the best available inns, hire armed guards for protection, and travel with servants who handled many of the practical details of medieval journey management. But even the best medieval travel accommodations were primitive by modern standards, and wealth couldn't eliminate the fundamental hazards of medieval transportation systems. Meanwhile, the legal complications of medieval travel were genuinely complex. Different territories had different laws, customs, and political arrangements that could affect travelers' rights and obligations. A knight who was perfectly legal in his home territory might find himself considered a criminal or enemy combatant just by crossing a political boundary. Understanding and navigating these legal complexities required considerable knowledge and diplomatic skill. And yet, despite all these challenges, medieval travel did serve important social and cultural functions. Pilgrimages provided opportunities for spiritual growth and cultural exchange. Military campaigns created networks of shared experience that transcended local political boundaries. Trade journeys facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies that drove medieval economic and cultural development. Still, perhaps, the most sobering aspect of medieval travel was how it highlighted the fundamental uncertainty and danger of medieval life. Modern people take for granted the ability to travel safely and reliably between distant locations. Medieval knights had to accept that any journey might be their last, not because of dramatic adventures or heroic battles, but because of mundane hazards like bad weather, equipment failure, or simple bad luck. By the later medieval period, improvements in road maintenance, bridge construction, and travel infrastructure began to make long-distance travel somewhat safer and more reliable. The development of better inns, more effective law enforcement, and improved navigation techniques all contributed to reducing the hazards of medieval transportation. But these improvements came gradually and unevenly, and most medieval knights spent their careers dealing with travel systems that were only marginally better than prehistoric. Migration patterns. The legacy of medieval travel challenges helps explain many aspects of modern transportation systems, from our emphasis on safety and reliability to our expectations of speed and convenience. The medieval experience of travel as a dangerous and uncertain undertaking influenced European culture for centuries, shaping everything from literature and religion to political and economic development. Let's be honest about medieval politics. It was like modern international relations conducted by people who settled diplomatic disagreements through trial by combat, and thought that the best way to negotiate was to show up armed and threaten to kill anyone who disagreed with you. That's right. Medieval knights operated in a political system where violence wasn't just an option. It was the primary means of communication, conflict resolution, and social advancement, creating a world where diplomatic skills meant knowing when to kill people and when to merely threaten to kill them. If you thought modern politics were divisive and hostile, medieval political life would make you grateful for even the most dysfunctional democratic institutions. Medieval knights lived in a world where political disputes were routinely resolved through warfare, where succession crises regularly led to civil wars that could last for decades, and where the difference between a political opponent and a mortal enemy was often just a matter of timing and convenient excuses for violence. To be fair, medieval political systems did develop sophisticated methods for managing conflict and maintaining social order. The feudal system, despite its many flaws, provided a framework for organizing society and resolving disputes that was more stable than complete anarchy. Medieval law codes, religious institutions, and cultural traditions all contributed to creating constraints on violence and channels for peaceful conflict resolution. Meanwhile, the personal nature of medieval politics meant that knights had to be skilled diplomats as well as warriors. Success in medieval society required the ability to navigate complex networks of personal relationships, family obligations, and political alliances that could change rapidly based on military victories, strategic marriages, inheritance disputes, and various other factors that were often beyond individual control. Of course, the fundamental problem with medieval politics was that it was based on the assumption that might makes right. Political legitimacy came from military strength. Succession rights were enforced through violence, and social status was determined by your ability to kill other people, or convince them that you might kill them if they didn't show proper respect. This created a system where rational negotiation was always secondary to the threat of physical force. Sound familiar? It's like workplace politics where every disagreement could escalate into a literal fight to the death, and where your career advancement depended on your willingness to physically intimidate your colleagues. Except in medieval politics, the fights actually were to the death, and losing a political dispute could result in execution, exile, or having your land seized by people who had better weapons than you did. And yet, despite the constant threat of violence, medieval politics did produce some genuinely skilled leaders who managed to create periods of relative peace and stability. The medieval period saw the development of legal systems, governmental institutions, and diplomatic practices that laid the foundation for modern European political development. Many medieval rulers demonstrated genuine administrative ability and political wisdom in managing the complex challenges of their time. Still, the most destructive aspect of medieval politics was probably the way it made long-term planning almost impossible. Political alliances could change overnight based on military developments, succession crises, or personal feuds between rulers. Knights who spent years building political relationships might find their entire strategy invalidated by a single battle, assassination, or strategic marriage that shifted the balance of power in their region. If you thought modern political uncertainty was stressful, medieval political life would drive you to drink, which, coincidentally, was one of the few reliable coping mechanisms available to medieval knights dealing with the constant stress of political violence. Knights had to live with the awareness that any political miscalculation could result in their death, exile, or financial ruin, often with very little warning and minimal opportunity for recovery. Meanwhile, the religious dimensions of medieval politics created additional complications that had no modern equivalent. Political conflicts were often framed in religious terms, with opposing sides claiming divine support for their causes. This religious justification made political disputes more intense and harder to resolve, since compromise on religious matters was often seen as spiritual betrayal rather than practical flexibility thought to be fair. Medieval Christianity did provide some constraints on political violence through concepts like the peace of God and just war theory. Religious institutions often served as mediators in political disputes and provided sanctuary for people fleeing from political persecution. And the Christian emphasis on moral behavior did influence some medieval rulers to adopt more humane and just political practices. But the combination of religious authority and political power also created opportunities for abuse that were genuinely terrifying. Medieval rulers who could claim religious legitimacy for their actions had few effective constraints on their behavior, leading to situations where political opponents could be branded as heretics and subjected to torture, execution, or other forms of persecution that were justified as religious obligations. Of course, the international dimensions of medieval politics were complicated by the lack of effective communication and transportation systems. Diplomatic negotiations between distant kingdoms could take months or years to complete, during which time political situations could change dramatically. Medieval diplomats had to operate with outdated information and limited ability to consult with their home governments about changing circumstances. Meanwhile, the economic aspects of medieval politics were fundamentally different from modern systems. Medieval rulers financed their activities primarily through land ownership, taxation of agricultural production, and plunder from successful military campaigns. This created incentives for aggressive military expansion and made peaceful economic development secondary to military success. And yet, despite all these limitations, medieval politics did produce some remarkable achievements in terms of cultural development, legal innovation, and international cooperation. The medieval period saw the development of universities, the codification of legal systems, and the establishment of trade networks that connected distant regions of Europe and beyond. Still, perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval politics was how it wasted human potential through unnecessary violence and conflict. Many talented individuals who might have contributed to art, science, literature, or economic development were instead channeled into military careers that often ended in early death or permanent disability. The medieval emphasis on martial virtues came at the expense of other forms of human achievement taught by the later medieval period. Changing military technology, economic systems, and political institutions began to reduce the importance of individual knights in political affairs. The development of professional armies, gunpowder weapons, and centralized governmental systems all contributed to making traditional knightly politics less relevant to actual governance. But throughout most of the medieval period, knights remained central figures in political life whose personal relationships, military capabilities, and strategic decisions shaped the development of European society. Their experiences with political violence and diplomatic complexity provide important insights into the challenges of governance in societies where physical force remained the ultimate arbiter of political disputes. Let's be clear about the decline of medieval knighthood. It was like watching a once dominant industry slowly realize that their entire business model had become obsolete. Except instead of adapting to market changes or retraining for new careers, most knights just kept doing the same things harder and more expensively, while complaining that the modern world didn't appreciate traditional values. That's right, by the late medieval period, knighthood was becoming a costly anachronism that persisted mainly because nobody wanted to admit that. Centuries of tradition and enormous financial investment had become essentially worthless. If you thought modern career disruption was difficult to handle, the technological and social changes that undermined medieval knighthood would make you grateful for retraining programs and unemployment insurance. Knights spent decades learning skills that were becoming militarily obsolete, investing fortunes in equipment that was increasingly ineffective, and maintaining social institutions that were being superseded by more efficient alternatives. To be fair, the decline of knighthood wasn't sudden or uniform across Europe. Different regions experienced different timelines and circumstances that affected how quickly and completely traditional knightly roles became irrelevant. Some knights successfully adapted to changing conditions by transitioning into new roles in royal administration, professional armies, or civilian governance. But many others struggled with the psychological and financial challenges of watching their entire way of life become obsolete. Meanwhile, the development of gunpowder weapons fundamentally changed the nature of medieval warfare in ways that undermined the military advantages that had made knights dominant for centuries. Crossbows had already begun to level the battlefield between knights and common soldiers, but firearms completed the process by making expensive armor and years of martial training less important than basic marksmanship skills that could be learned in weeks rather than decades. Of course, knights didn't immediately recognize or accept the implications of these technological changes. Many continued to invest in increasingly elaborate and expensive armor designs that were supposed to provide protection against firearms, but actually just made knights more expensive targets without significantly improving their battlefield effectiveness. It was like investing in better buggy whips while automobiles were taking over transportation. Sound familiar? It's like watching any traditional industry resist technological change by doubling down on existing practices rather than adapting to new realities. Except in this case, the resistance to change was literally a matter of life and death, and the people making the decisions had spent their entire lives defining their identity and social status around skills that were becoming irrelevant. And yet, the military obsolescence of knighthood was only part of a larger pattern of social and economic changes that were transforming medieval society. The rise of professional armies, centralized government administration, and money-based economies all contributed to making traditional feudal relationships less important for maintaining social order and political stability. Still, perhaps the most psychologically difficult aspect of knightly decline was how it challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and personal worth that had been central to medieval culture for centuries. Knights had been taught from childhood that their social position was justified by their military function and moral superiority. When that military function became obsolete, it raised uncomfortable questions about the entire basis of aristocratic privilege. If you thought modern identity crises were challenging, the late medieval crisis of knightly identity would overwhelm you with its existential implications. Knights had to confront the possibility that their entire social system was based on assumptions that were no longer valid, while simultaneously trying to maintain their economic position and social status in a world that was rapidly changing around them. Meanwhile, the economic costs of maintaining traditional knightly lifestyle had become unsustainable for many families by the late medieval period. The arms race in military technology, the expenses of maintaining social status, and the declining military relevance of individual knights created a situation where knighthood was pricing itself out of practical utility while becoming more expensive than ever to maintain. To be fair, some knights did successfully adapt to changing conditions by finding new roles that utilized their skills and social connections. Military leadership in professional armies, diplomatic service, colonial administration, and various forms of government bureaucracy all provided opportunities for knights to maintain their social status while serving different functions than their medieval predecessors. But adaptation required accepting that traditional knightly values and practices needed to be substantially modified or abandoned. Knights who clung too tightly to medieval traditions often found themselves increasingly isolated and financially stressed, while those who adapted too completely risked losing the cultural identity that had defined their families for generations. Of course, the cultural legacy of medieval knighthood was too powerful and appealing to disappear completely, even as its practical military and political functions became obsolete. The romantic idealization of knightly virtues, the appeal of martial honor and individual heroism, and the nostalgic attraction of a simpler time when moral choices seemed clearer, all contributed to preserving knightly imagery and ideals long after medieval society had ended. Meanwhile, the transformation of knighthood from a practical military profession into a largely ceremonial social status reflected broader changes in how European societies understood the relationship between social privilege and functional utility. The late medieval period saw the beginning of debates about aristocratic legitimacy that would eventually lead to major political and social revolutions in later centuries. And yet, despite all the challenges and contradictions of its decline, medieval knighthood did leave important legacies that continue to influence modern society. Concepts of professional military service, individual honor and responsibility, and the obligation of privilege to serve broader social purposes all trace their roots back to medieval knightly ideals, even though the specific context and applications have changed dramatically. Still, the most important lesson from the decline of medieval knighthood may be about the difficulty of adapting to fundamental changes in social and technological conditions. The knights who successfully navigated the transition from medieval to early modern society were generally those who were willing to question traditional assumptions and experiment with new approaches, rather than those who insisted that old methods would work if only they were applied more rigorously. By the Renaissance period, knighthood had largely transformed from a practical military profession into a form of social theater that preserved the symbols and rituals of medieval warrior culture while serving primarily ceremonial and cultural functions. This transformation allowed knightly traditions to survive and influence later historical developments, but it also marked the definitive end of the medieval world in which knights had played central roles in warfare, politics, and social organization. The story of knightly decline thus provides important insights into how traditional institutions and professions respond to disruptive change. Some adapt and evolve, some resist and eventually disappear, and some transform into new forms that preserve certain elements while abandoning others. Understanding these patterns can help modern people navigate similar challenges in their own professional and social lives. Of course, the romantic appeal of medieval knighthood ensures that its cultural influence continues even today. Movies, literature, video games, and various other forms of popular culture continue to draw on knightly imagery and ideals, often in ways that bear little resemblance to historical reality, but that serve important psychological and cultural functions. For modern audiences seeking meaning, purpose, and moral clarity in complex times, let's be honest about the legacy of medieval knights. It was like a historical game of telephone where the original message got so distorted through centuries of retelling that we ended up with a romanticized fantasy that bears about as much resemblance to medieval reality as Disney movies do to actual fairy tales. That's right. The knights we think we know from literature, movies, and popular culture are essentially fictional characters created by people who lived centuries after the medieval period ended and who had their own reasons for reinventing knightly history to serve their contemporary purposes. If you thought modern media distorted current events, the historical treatment of medieval knighthood would make you question everything you think you know about the past. The age of chivalry that people nostalgically reference never actually existed in the form that popular culture presents. Real medieval knights were dealing with practical problems, political pressures, and economic challenges that were far more complex and morally ambiguous than the simplified narratives of good versus evil that dominate our cultural imagination. To be fair, medieval knights did leave some genuine legacies that continue to influence modern society in important ways. The development of professional military traditions, the evolution of legal systems, and the creation of cultural institutions all owe something to medieval knightly contributions. But these real legacies are often less dramatic and inspiring than the mythological versions that have captured popular imagination. Meanwhile, the actual historical impact of medieval knights was much more complicated and morally ambiguous than either their critics or their admirers typically acknowledge. Knights were simultaneously agents of social order and social oppression, protectors of civilization and perpetrators of violence, defenders of noble ideals and participants in brutal political systems. Understanding their real legacy requires grappling with these contradictions, rather than resolving them into simple narratives of heroism or villainy. Of course, one of the most important legacies of medieval knighthood was its role in developing concepts of professional military service that continue to influence modern armed forces. The medieval emphasis on military training, discipline, and esprit de corps laid groundwork for later developments in military organization and culture. Modern military academies, officer training programs, and military traditions all bear traces of medieval knightly influence. Even though the specific practices have evolved considerably. Sound familiar? It's like how modern corporate culture borrows language and concepts from historical institutions while adapting them to completely different contexts and purposes. The words and symbols remain recognizable, but their meaning and application have changed so much that the connections are often more nostalgic than substantive. And yet, perhaps the most significant legacy of medieval knighthood was its contribution to developing ideas about individual honor, personal responsibility, and the obligations that come with social privilege. The medieval concept that high social status should be justified by service to broader social purposes continues to influence how we think about leadership, public service, and social responsibility, even though the specific applications have changed dramatically. Still, the most problematic aspect of knightly legacy is probably the way it has been used to romanticize violence and justify various forms of social inequality. The mythological version of knighthood has been invoked to support everything from military adventurism to aristocratic privilege, often by people who conveniently ignore the historical realities of medieval society and the genuine costs of the systems they're celebrating. If you thought modern political rhetoric was disconnected from historical reality, the ways that knightly imagery and language get used in contemporary politics would amaze you with their creative interpretation of Medieval history. Politicians, activists, and cultural commentators regularly invoke knightly ideals and imagery to support positions that would have been completely incomprehensible to actual medieval knights. Meanwhile, the literary and artistic legacy of medieval knighthood has been genuinely influential in shaping European and Western culture. The development of romantic literature, heroic narratives, and various forms of popular entertainment all owe considerable debts to medieval knightly traditions. But these cultural influences have also contributed to creating unrealistic expectations about heroism, moral clarity, and the possibility of individual actions to solve complex social problems. To be fair, some aspects of medieval knightly culture did represent genuine moral and social progress for their time. The medieval emphasis on protecting the weak, showing mercy to defeated enemies, and maintaining personal honor in difficult circumstances did provide some constraints on violence and exploitation that were improvements over earlier and more brutal social systems. But even these positive aspects of knightly culture were limited by the social and economic contexts in which they developed. Medieval concepts of protecting the weak were restricted to specific social groups and didn't extend to challenging the fundamental inequalities that created weakness and vulnerability in the first place. Knightly mercy was typically reserved for other nobles, while peasants and commoners received little protection from knightly violence. Of course, the technological and tactical innovations associated with medieval knighthood did have lasting influence on military development. Medieval innovations in armor design, weapons technology, and cavalry tactics influenced military thinking for centuries and contributed to developments that eventually made medieval warfare itself obsolete. The medieval period saw genuine advances in metallurgy, engineering, and military organization that laid groundwork for later technological progress. Meanwhile, the political and legal traditions that developed around medieval knighthood contributed to the evolution of European governmental systems in ways that continue to influence modern political institutions. Medieval concepts of feudal obligation, legal procedure, and the relationship between individual rights and social responsibilities all influenced later constitutional and legal developments, even though the specific applications have changed dramatically. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson from the legacy of medieval knighthood is about the danger of romanticizing the past in ways that prevent us from learning from historical experience. The mythological version of knighthood has often been used to avoid confronting the genuine moral complexities and practical challenges that medieval people faced, creating unrealistic expectations about the possibility of simple solutions to complex problems. Still, understanding the real history of medieval knights can provide valuable insights into how people navigate the challenges of living up to high ideals while dealing with practical constraints. Medieval knights were neither the perfect heroes of romantic literature nor the brutal oppressors of some historical critiques. They were human beings trying to make sense of their circumstances and fulfill their obligations as they understood. Then, by the modern period, the transformation of knighthood from a practical profession into a cultural symbol was essentially complete. Modern knightly orders, ceremonial titles, and various other forms of neo-chivalric activity preserve certain aspects of medieval tradition while serving completely different social and cultural functions. These modern adaptations demonstrate both the enduring appeal of knightly ideals and their flexibility in serving different historical contexts. The real legacy of medieval knights thus lies not in any specific achievements or failures, but in their demonstration of how human beings respond to the challenge of trying to create meaning, purpose, and moral order in difficult circumstances. Their successes and failures, their nobility and brutality, their idealism and pragmatism all provide examples of the eternal human struggle to balance competing obligations and conflicting values while trying to build lives worth living in an Uncertain world. Of course, learning from this legacy requires distinguishing between the historical reality of medieval knighthood and the various mythological versions that have been created to serve different cultural and political purposes. The real knights of medieval Europe were complex individuals dealing with complex challenges, and their experiences offer insights that are more subtle and ultimately more useful than the simplified narratives that dominate popular understanding of the medieval period. Sound familiar? It should, because the gap between historical reality and cultural mythology is a constant feature of how societies understand their past and use historical examples to make sense of contemporary challenges. The story of medieval knighthood's real legacy is ultimately a reminder that understanding history requires looking beyond the stories we want to believe to grapple with the more complex and morally ambiguous realities that actually shaped human experience. So there you have it. The complete, unvarnished truth about why being a knight in medieval times was one of history's worst career choices, despite the glamorous reputation that Hollywood and medieval literature have created. From the nightmare of training through the horrors of combat to the daily miseries of medieval life, knighthood was essentially a perfect storm of impossible expectations, crushing debt, constant danger, and social obligations that would make modern middle management look like a vacation. Of course, knights did play important roles in medieval society, and some individuals managed to find success, satisfaction, and even happiness within the constraints of their historical context. The medieval period produced genuine heroes, innovative leaders, and skilled warriors who made significant contributions to European development. But for every success story, there were countless others who struggled with the impossible demands of their profession and the fundamental contradictions of medieval society. Meanwhile, the legacy of medieval knighthood continues to influence modern culture in ways both obvious and subtle. Our ideas about heroism, honor, military service, and social responsibility all bear traces of medieval chivalric ideals, even though the specific contexts have changed dramatically. The tension between romantic idealization and practical reality that characterized medieval knighthood remains a feature of how we think about many professions and social roles today. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson from the medieval knight's experience is the reminder that every historical period has its own unique challenges, and that people in the past were dealing with problems that were just as complex and difficult as the ones we face today. The knights who struggled with medieval warfare, politics, and economics were wrestling with fundamentally human problems in contexts that were shaped by their particular historical circumstances. Still, when you're complaining about modern life, traffic jams, mortgage payments, workplace politics, healthcare costs, it's worth remembering that at least you're not expected to charge into battle wearing 70 pounds of metal, while maintaining perfect moral standards and managing a complex web of feudal obligations that could get you killed if you made the wrong political choice. The medieval knight's story is ultimately a reminder that progress in human civilization is real, even if it's sometimes slower and more complicated than we'd like. We may have our own problems, but at least we don't have to solve them while wearing armor and carrying swords. That's got to count for something. Sound familiar? It should, because the gap between romantic ideals and practical reality is a constant feature of human experience, whether you're talking about medieval knighthood or modern career choices. The details change, but the fundamental challenge of trying to live up to impossible standards while dealing with practical constraints remains remarkably consistent across centuries. At least now we can complain about it on social media instead of having to suffer in silence while wearing uncomfortable metal clothing. And there you have it, the complete, unvarnished, and thoroughly depressing truth about why being a knight in medieval times was essentially a career choice that combined all the worst aspects of modern life with additional opportunities for violent death. financial ruin, and social humiliation. From the moment you were shipped off to serve as a page at age 7 until the day you died, probably prematurely from combat injuries, disease, or the various other hazards of medieval existence, knighthood was a grinding marathon of impossible expectations, crushing expenses, and constant danger. Let's be honest about why this matters today. Understanding the reality of medieval knighthood isn't just an academic exercise in historical accuracy. It's a lesson about how human societies create and maintain mythologies that serve contemporary purposes while completely distorting historical truth. The knights we think we know from movies, books, and popular culture are essentially propaganda created by people who lived centuries after the medieval period ended and who had their own reasons for reinventing the past to serve their present needs. That's right. The age of chivalry the people nostalgically reference was largely invented by 19th century romantics who were dealing with the social disruptions of industrialization and democratization. They created an idealized version of medieval society that never actually existed, populated by noble knights who embodied virtues that were supposed to shame modern people into better behavior. It was basically historical fan fiction written by people who had never experienced the reality of medieval life and who were using the past as a weapon in contemporary political and cultural battles. If you thought modern fake news was a problem, the historical construction of knightly mythology would make you realize that human beings have been creating convenient alternative facts for centuries. The difference is that medieval people didn't have the benefit of archaeological evidence, documentary sources, and historical methodology that might have corrected their misconceptions. They were working with limited information and strong incentives to interpret that information in ways that supported their existing beliefs and interests. To be fair, the people who created and perpetuated knightly mythology weren't necessarily trying to deceive anyone. They were often genuinely trying to understand their own historical heritage and draw lessons that might help them navigate contemporary challenges. The problem was that they approached medieval history with assumptions and expectations that prevented them from seeing medieval knights as they actually were. Complex human beings dealing with practical problems in specific historical circumstances. Meanwhile, the persistence of knightly mythology demonstrates something important about human psychology and the way societies use historical narratives to create meaning and purpose. People need heroes, role models, and inspiring examples of human potential. When reality doesn't provide sufficiently inspiring examples, human beings are perfectly capable of creating fictional ones and then forgetting that they're fictional. Of course, this tendency to mythologize the past isn't necessarily harmful. Mythology and storytelling serve important psychological and social functions that pure historical accuracy might not fulfill. The problem comes when people start making decisions based on mythological understanding of history rather than grappling with the actual complexity and moral ambiguity of past human experience. Sound familiar? It should, because the same psychological and social forces that created knightly mythology are still operating today in how we understand and interpret contemporary events. The human tendency to simplify complex situations into narratives of good versus evil, to romanticize certain time periods or social roles, and to use historical examples to justify contemporary positions without fully understanding those historical contexts. All of these patterns continue to influence modern political and cultural discourse. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson from the reality of medieval knighthood is about the danger of expecting any individual or social role to embody perfect virtues or solve complex social problems through heroic action. Real knights were neither the perfect heroes of romantic literature nor the brutal oppressors of some historical critiques. They were human beings trying to make sense of their circumstances and fulfill their obligations as they understood them. with all the limitations and contradictions that implies. Still, understanding the gap between knightly reality and knightly mythology can help us approach our own historical moment with more realistic expectations and more nuanced understanding. The medieval knights who struggled with impossible expectations, financial pressure, and moral ambiguity were dealing with fundamentally human challenges that continue to shape individual and social experience today, even though the specific context and constraints have changed. The real knights of medieval Europe were neither inspirational heroes nor cautionary villains. They were people trying to build meaningful lives while navigating systems and circumstances that were often beyond their individual control. Their successes and failures, their noble aspirations and practical compromises, their courage and their cowardice all provide examples of the eternal human struggle to create purpose and meaning while dealing with limitation and uncertainty. If you thought modern life was challenging, with its career pressures, financial obligations, social expectations, and moral complexities, at least you're not expected to do it while wearing 70 pounds of metal armor and risking violent death on a regular basis. That's gotta count for something. But perhaps the most sobering lesson from medieval knighthood is that every generation faces its own version of impossible expectations and practical constraints. The specific details change, but the fundamental human challenge of trying to live up to ideals while dealing with reality remains remarkably consistent across centuries. Medieval knights weren't uniquely disadvantaged. They were just dealing with their particular version of the universal human condition. Meanwhile, the fact that we continue to find knightly imagery and ideals compelling despite their historical limitations suggests something important about human psychology and social organization. People need inspiring examples, moral frameworks, and cultural narratives that help them make sense of their experience and motivate them to strive for something better than mere survival and personal gratification. The key is learning to distinguish between the inspirational and aspirational value of historical examples and their literal accuracy as guides for contemporary action. We can appreciate knightly ideals of courage, honor, and service without accepting knightly assumptions about violence, hierarchy, and social organization. We can learn from medieval experiences without trying to recreate medieval solutions to modern problems. And yet, the most enduring legacy of medieval knighthood may be its demonstration that human beings are capable of remarkable dedication, sacrifice, and moral commitment, even in circumstances that seem designed to discourage such virtues. Medieval knights may not have been the perfect heroes of romantic literature, but many of them did display genuine courage, loyalty, and concern for others that deserve recognition and respect, even when we acknowledge the limitations and contradictions of their historical context. Of course, learning from this legacy requires understanding medieval knights as they actually were, rather than as we might wish they had been. This means grappling with the moral ambiguities, practical contradictions, and human limitations that characterize medieval knighthood, while also recognizing the genuine achievements and noble aspirations that emerge from that complex historical experience. The story of medieval knighthood is ultimately a human story, one that reveals both the potential and the limitations of individual effort to create meaning and moral order in challenging circumstances. Understanding this story in all its complexity can help modern people navigate their own challenges with more realistic expectations and more nuanced understanding of what it means to try to live a worthwhile life in an uncertain world. Sound familiar? It should, because despite all the changes in technology, social organization, and cultural values that separate us from the medieval period, the fundamental human challenges of creating meaning, purpose, and moral order in difficult circumstances remain remarkably consistent. The medieval knights who struggled with these challenges weren't perfect, but they were human, and their imperfect efforts to build something worthy from their circumstances continue to offer insights that are relevant to anyone trying to do the same thing today. So, the next time someone tells you about the good old days when knights were noble and chivalrous and everything was better than it is now, you can politely remind them that those good old days never actually existed. And that's probably for the best. Real human history is more complex, more interesting, and ultimately more useful than the simplified mythologies we create to make ourselves feel better about contemporary challenges. After all, if medieval knights could figure out how to find meaning and purpose while wearing uncomfortable metal clothing and facing the constant possibility of violent death, maybe the rest of us can figure out how to deal with whatever challenges our own historical moment happens to throw at us. And we get to do it with indoor plumbing, modern medicine, and the right to complain about it on social media. That's definitely progress.